Science Rocks. We're in downtown St. Petersburg, learning about the STEM of art. This is the Morean Art Center for Clay in downtown St. Petersburg. Matt Sheeman is the studio artist manager.
Well, clay, there's a lot of different types of clays that you're going to go through. So even when we're making the clay, we have certain ingredients that we're using to design the clay. You want it to be certain properties, how workable it's going to be, what kind of temperature you're going to go to with it. We're trying to make it so that way the clay can get fired up to about 2,400 degrees. So there's components and everything there that we're working with.
How does the water help when you're molding your piece?
The water is basically a lubricant, so it's keeping your hands from sticking to the clay. It's allowing it so it can smoothly move along it. When you're throwing clay, when you look at it underneath a microscope, it looks a lot like the salt flats out in Utah. Like they're real kind of scaly and everything. So what you're doing when you're throwing is that you're trying to align all these particles together. Well, I think it's something that everybody can do. It's difficult at first, but it's really engaging. There's a tactile feel to it and everything, so people can kind of relate to it a little bit. And then there are things you want to have in your home, there are things you want to put in your kitchen and all that, so it's another thing that people can easily relate to. In the family for a long time, so I found out that it was something I really liked, I enjoyed, decided to get a master's degree in it, and then came here for a residency program, and then got hired on to the Morean Center for Clay. So as you're throwing these cylinders, you're trying to make sure that they're staying upright, because the entire time that you're throwing, you're fighting centrifugal force, so it's going to want to get wider and wider and wider the entire time. And the wider something gets, the harder it is to bring it back in. So you always want to start more narrow and bring them out a little bit as you're going.
What are some of the next steps that you would take?
The first thing you do is you let this dry. So it's just going to air dry for a while, and that's just to let all the water evaporate out of it, because you want to put it into a kiln to take it up to about 1900 degrees. And if you have any water that's in it, that water will boil and steam, and then your piece will explode. So you want to make sure that there's all the water's taken out of it first before you put it in the kiln. So the first firing that you're going to go through is called a bisque firing. That's when we're going to take it up to about anywhere from 1700 to about 1900 degrees. And that's going to be changing it from clay and into actually ceramic. So at that point, it can't go back to clay. When it's just sitting on the shelves air drying, you can take it and you can wet it down. It can be turned back into clay. But once it goes up above about 1200 degrees, that's when it changes from alpha quartz to beta quartz, and that's when it goes through the chemical change of actually becoming ceramic at that point. We get a lot of people in here that have an idea of what they're going to make, and they've never made something before, so probably coming in with a much more open idea of how things are going to look is your best approach. This is a skill, it's a craft, so it does take some time and practice in order to make certain things.
Next, we learned more about the heating process with Adam Youngbluff. Can you share with us what these kilns are used for and how they function?
Sure. This room, we have 15 different electric kilns. We primarily use them for what's called bisque firing, and that's the initial firing that takes the clay from a soft, malleable piece of clay to a hard ceramic. It's not dense enough yet to hold water, but it's hard enough to where you can handle it and you're not going to warp it or break things off. So we'll load this kiln full. It's got electric heating elements that fire on and off based on what this computer tells it to do. Okay. And then it usually takes about a 3-day turnaround. There's a day of preheating, a day of firing, and then a day of cooling. The preheating is really the most important part because we're using so much water with the clay when we're working with it. If we fire it too fast, the water is going to turn to steam and start to boil, and that's when things blow up. So we typically have to hold it just under 212 degrees for about 8 hours just to be safe, and sometimes longer.
So there is a lot of STEM involved in what you're doing here. And there are a lot of ways anyone can learn more about working with clay.
Well, here we offer wheel throwing classes, hand building classes. There's some glazing classes for more advanced students, mold making. We have summer camp classes for kids. And then we also have a Friday night clay class that lasts for about 2 hours. Anyone can come in, with any background, no background, and try it for kind of a first time. And they get to make something, usually like a bowl or a cup. And it's usually finished for them in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
So it doesn't have to be somebody experienced. It could be somebody like me.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of who we're trying to gravitate towards, because people that know about the clay world tend to know about us here, but it's really trying to expose ourselves to people who aren't as familiar and teaching them how great it is to make things and use things out of clay.
And our next stop is the Morean Glass Studio and Hot Shop, where we get to learn about the STEM behind blowing glass. Jeremiah Jacobs is a glass artist who had an unusual introduction into this medium.
I started, I got about 15 years in production pottery, and that's really where I started. About 3 years ago, I came to St. Petersburg for an artisan residency at the Craftsman House Gallery in ceramics, and I met a couple of the glass blowers locally and started weeding the garden. For every 4 hours of weeding the garden I would get 1 hour of hot shop time, and so yeah, I just kind of slowly worked my way by sweeping the floor. Eventually, you get to turn the pipe a little bit.
And then impart that custom form into the glass.
The artistry of glass is very exciting. It's one of those things that keeps you up at night. You're falling asleep and you're like thinking about what you did today and how you're going to be able to do it a little differently tomorrow. The majority of the work that I do has heavy Athenian influences. All the ceramic work that I did was a lot of Athenian-based reconstruction, and so a lot of sections and attaching feet into bellies and blowing necks, and so I'm working a lot to replicate my ceramic work in glass now.
Will then be positioned to become the hottest.
Part of our segment is to look at the STEM behind everything in our world. Tell us what glass really is.
The glass that we're using is created by adding silica, soda ash, and lime in different proportions to create what we know as glass. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that we melt sand. And now, while there is silica in sand, there's no sand in silica. Sand has many other components to it. If you look at it under magnification, it looks like a seashell collection. Like little tiny microscopic shells, which they don't melt.
So in order to restore the ease of workability, we simply go back and restore the temperature, which restores the softness, which allows us then to continue working easily through the heat.
Some of the science, for instance, to create the initial bubble, we put a puff of air in the pipe. The puff of air travels down the length of the pipe, comes in contact with the molten glass, and as we know what happens to air when it's heated, it expands. And the gaffer has his thumb over the end of the pipe. As that air expands, it has nowhere to go but into that soft material to create the initial bubble.
We have over 220 after-school STEM academies in Pinellas County. How can people get involved with what you're doing?
Well, we have a program here where they can come and do a half-hour session with one of our glass blowers and create a paperweight or a small ornament and get a very rough introduction to the processes, and as they get their hands on a blowpipe and on the tools and are able to manipulate the glass into form, and they actually get to take the creation home with them the next day. And that's more of the science. These pieces, after we create them, have to go through a controlled cool down very slowly overnight, allowing all portions of that piece, thick and thin, to cool off at the same rate. Because the thin parts of the piece will cool quicker than the thick parts, and that will create a temperature disparity within the piece, and that can cause a crack or a shear. But by putting that into the annealer and cooling it slowly overnight, it gives us a viable piece when we open the annealer in the morning and not a pile of shards.
Should that rod attack, it breaks right away. We're going to take that immediately.
Yeah, well, St. Petersburg proves to be a really opportunistic area right now, especially for glass. Get in there, learn what a puntee is, learn how to do these different maneuvers, and then start knocking on those shop doors and being like, hey, I'm here and I'm ready.
When we come back, we stay in downtown St. Petersburg to see how USF helps STEM education for Pinellas County schools. Science Rocks rolls on.